Sergeant James Miller tore the scorecard off the board and held it up like something dead. "This," he shouted, jabbing his finger at the numbers, "is a paper soldier, perfect score, 0 combat, and they hand her a spot in this unit. She's going to get one of us killed." The whole room laughed. 25-year-old Megan Walker sat in the back and said nothing. But in 72 hours, this same man would be down on his knees in the snow, watching her thread a bullet through wind no sniper in this army believed could be beaten, whispering the only question that mattered: where did you learn that? Before we begin, take 1 second to subscribe to the channel. Follow this story all the way to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see just how far my story has traveled. The morning it happened, nobody in the room was thinking about Megan Walker. They were thinking about the target. For almost 3 hours, the entire tactical team had been chasing a single simulated position, hidden somewhere in the folds of the mountain, and for almost 3 hours that position had beaten every one of them. Veteran shooters with decades between them had run the numbers over and over, and every time the answer came back the same. Too far, too much wind, too many variables stacked one on top of another until the shot stopped being a shot and became a joke somebody in command had decided to play on them. "Read it again," Colonel Richard Hayes said. He was standing behind the line with his hands folded behind his back, and his voice was quiet, which was worse than if he'd been yelling. Sergeant Miller lowered his spotting scope and rubbed his eyes. "Same as before, sir. We've got a crosswind pushing hard from the left, and the second we compensate for it, we lose the elevation. The math doesn't close. It's not that it's hard, it's that it can't be done from this position." "Then find me a position where it can." "There isn't one, sir. Not that we can reach before the exercise clock runs out." Hayes didn't answer right away. He'd been running men through this ridge for 11 years, and in 11 years, he had learned that the hardest thing about command was not making decisions. It was standing still while good men told you something was impossible, and knowing somewhere in your gut that impossible was just a word people used when they'd run out of ideas. "Corporal Reyes," he said, "your read." Reyes was younger, 29, and still hungry enough to want to disagree with the sergeant. But even he shook his head. "I'd take the shot if you ordered it, Colonel. I'd also miss, and I'd rather tell you that now than after." A low murmur went around the group. Nobody liked to say it out loud, but everybody was thinking it. The exercise had been designed to test them, and the test had won. That was when the newest member of the unit stood up. She didn't announce it. She didn't clear her throat or ask permission. She just rose from where she'd been sitting quietly at the back for the better part of an hour, walked to the front of the line, and looked out at the same terrain that had defeated 8 experienced men. Miller saw her first, and his mouth twisted. "Sit down, Walker." "I'd like to look," Megan said. "You'd like to look." He turned to the others as if inviting them to enjoy the show. "The paper soldier would like to look. By all means, take the scope. Tell us all what we missed." She took the scope. There was a particular kind of silence that fell over the line then, and it wasn't respect. It was the silence of men waiting to be proven right. They had already decided how this ended. She would look, she would frown, she would hand the scope back, and she would learn the lesson every rookie learned eventually, that the paper doesn't hold up when the mountain pushes back. Megan knelt. She didn't reach for a rifle. She didn't ask for numbers. She simply looked, and while she looked, she was quiet in a way that made a few of them uneasy without knowing why. It was not the quiet of someone who was lost. It was the quiet of someone who was listening. "You've been reading the wind wrong," she said. Miller barked out a laugh. "Is that right? You're reading it at the muzzle and at the target." She didn't look up from the scope. "But there's a third band of air about 2/3 of the way across moving against the other 2. You can see it in the trees. The lower branches are going one direction and the tops are going the other. Whatever you're calculating for the crosswind, it reverses across the valley and then reverses again. That's why your corrections keep failing. You're solving for one wind. There are 3. Nobody laughed now. Reyes leaned in and looked where she was pointing, and his face changed. "The tops are moving right," he said slowly. "But the mid-level," "She's right, sir. The mid-level's going left. I never split it out because nobody splits it out." Miller cut in, but there was something under his voice now, something that hadn't been there a minute ago. "You don't chase 3 separate wind bands on a live shot. You'd be adjusting until the sun went down." "You don't chase them," Megan said. "You let them cancel." She finally looked up, and she looked at the sergeant directly without heat, without triumph, without anything at all, except a flat, unnerving certainty. The top band and the bottom band nearly cancel each other. The middle band is the one that matters, and it's smaller than you think because the other two are eating it from both sides. You've been correcting for the full value of a win that's already been reduced by 2/3. That's why every shot you modeled goes wide. You're overcorrecting for a win that mostly isn't there. Colonel Hayes had not said a word during any of this. He was watching her the way a man watches a card he can't quite believe he's been dealt. Sergeant Miller, Hayes said, give me a number. If she's right, just the number. Miller stared at Megan for a long moment. Then, jaw tight, he ran it. His pencil moved fast across the pad, then slowed, then stopped. He looked at what he'd written, like he wasn't sure he'd written it. If she's right, he said, and it clearly cost him, then the shot's not impossible. It's tight, but it's inside the envelope, barely. Then somebody take it. And here was the thing none of them expected, because when Hayes said take it, every experienced man on that line looked at the ground. Not out of fear, out of honesty, because reading the wind and shooting the wind were two different animals, and knowing where a bullet needed to go had never once in the history of the craft been the same as putting it there. To trust three canceling wind bands and a rookie's raid and stake your reputation on a shot, the whole unit had already called impossible. That took a kind of nerve that had nothing to do with rank. I'll take it, Megan said. Miller's head came up. Absolutely not. Sergeant, Hayes's voice didn't rise, but it landed. It was her read, it's her shot. With respect, Colonel, it's her funeral. She misses this. She doesn't just embarrass herself. She tells every man on this line that we stood down for a guess. That's what this is. It's a guess dressed up in confidence, and I've seen 100 kids walk in here with confidence and walk out with nothing. Then let her walk out with nothing, Hayes said. But she takes the shot. Megan was already moving. She settled behind the rifle with a stillness that made even Miller stop talking. There was no drama in the way she did it. No performance. She lay down behind the weapon like she was lying down to sleep, and her breathing slowed and her hands did not shake, and for the first time some of the men on that line felt a small, cold uncertainty crawl up their spines. The uncertainty of people who have judged someone quickly and are beginning to suspect they judged wrong. Talk me through it, Hayes said quietly. He didn't have to, but something told him he wanted to hear it, that whatever came out of her mouth in the next 30 seconds would tell him more about her than any file ever had. Winds shifting on a 4-second cycle, Megan said, her voice barely above the sound of her own breath. It gusts, then it settles. I'm not shooting the gust, I'm shooting the settle. There's a window right after the trees go still, about 1.5 seconds. A pause, maybe less. That's a small window, Reyes murmured. It's the only window. She waited. And the waiting was the part none of them would ever forget, because a lesser shooter would have taken the shot the moment the target lined up, and a nervous shooter would have taken it early just to end the agony of everyone watching. But Megan Walker lay there and let 3 good chances pass. Let them pass. Miller actually flinched the first time she didn't fire, then the second, and by the third, his hands had curled into fists at his sides, and he leaned toward Reyes and whispered, "She's frozen. She's choking. I told you." "She's not choking," Reyes said. And he didn't know how he knew, but he knew. "She's counting." The trees at the mid-slope shivered bent, and then for one breath went perfectly still. Megan fired. The sound rolled off the ridge and came back and rolled off again, and then there was nothing. No cheer, no reaction. Just 8 men and 1 colonel staring downrange at a target none of them could see well enough to confirm, waiting for a radio to tell them what they had just witnessed. The seconds stretched. Miller had stopped breathing. Reyes had stopped breathing. Even Hayes, who had confirmed 1,000 shots in his career and taught himself long ago never to hope, felt something tighten in his chest that he had no business feeling at his age and rank. The radio crackled. Range control to Raven line, confirming impact. A pause that lasted a small eternity. Center mass, clean hit. Repeat, clean, hit, dead center. Whoever took that shot, range control would like to know how. Nobody moved. Megan lowered her head to the stock of the rifle for just a moment, and it was the only human thing anyone saw her do, a small private exhale there, and Gone the release of a woman who had known she could make the shot and was still somehow relieved that she had. Then she pushed herself up, brushed off her sleeves, and began calmly to pack her equipment. That was what undid them more than the shot, not the impossible bullet. The fact that, having fired it, she simply put her gear away like she'd done nothing more remarkable than sign her name. "Say something," Reyes said. He almost laughed. "Walker, do you understand what you just did? Say something." "There's nothing to say," Megan said. "The math was right." The math. Miller's voice came out strange. He was staring at her rifle, then at her hands, then at her face, and every time he looked, he seemed to like the answer less. "The math was right. That's it. That's all you've got. You just made a shot that 8 men with 100 years of experience between them called impossible, and your explanation is the math was right." It was. Nobody makes that shot cold. Nobody. I've watched national champions blow easier ones. You don't walk in off the street with a clean record and no combat and make that shot on a mountain you've never stood on unless he stopped. Something crossed his face, and it wasn't kindness, but it wasn't the contempt from earlier either. It was the beginning of a much more dangerous emotion. Curiosity. Unless somebody taught you, and I don't mean the army. Megan didn't answer. She zipped her case, checked the latches, and stood, and for the first time since she joined the unit, not one man on that line could think of a single thing to say to make themselves feel taller than her. Colonel Hayes broke the silence. He walked toward her slowly, the way a man walks towards something he doesn't fully understand, and he stopped a few feet away and looked at the rifle, and then he looked at her. And the question that came out of him was not the question of a commander to a subordinate. It was the question of one human being who had just seen something he could not explain, asking the only person who could explain it. "Where did you learn that?" And Megan Walker, who had answered every drill instructor, every review board, every skeptical veteran, with the same flat patient certainty, did not answer him right away. Because the answer was not in any file. It was not in a training record, or a marksmanship badge, or a line on a form. The answer lived somewhere the Army had never been, in a small mountain town in Montana on cold mornings, before the sun, beside a man who had been dead for 7 years and whose voice she still heard every single time she settled behind a rifle and told herself to wait. "That's a long story, sir," was all she said. Hayes studied at her a moment longer. Then he nodded once and turned to the rest of the line, and his voice changed, entirely sharp now, and loud, the voice of a man snapping a room full of stunned soldiers back to attention. "Exercise is complete. Secure your gear. Debrief in 30. He paused. "And gentlemen, if any of you learned something out here today, I suggest you remember who you learned it from." They filed off the line in silence, but Miller lingered. He waited until the others had moved off, until it was just him and Megan and the wind coming up off the valley, and then he crossed to her, and there was something working in his face that he clearly didn't enjoy, some argument he was having with himself and losing. "I called you a paper soldier," he said. "I heard. In front of the whole unit. I heard that too." He nodded slowly. He was a proud man, and pride does not bend easily, and for a moment it looked like he might just turn and walk away and let it stand. But something about the shot had cracked something in him, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost all its edge. "That red on the wind, the 3 bands, canceling." He shook his head. "I've been doing this 18 years. I have never once thought to split the middle out from the top and bottom and let them eat each other. Not once. Where does a 25-year-old learn to see air like that?" Megan looked at him for a long moment. "My father," she said, "used to make me sit on a mountain and not move for 2 hours when I was 7. Miller waited for the rest. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole secret. He made me sit still and pay attention until paying attention was the only thing I knew how to do. Everything else is just math." She picked up her case. "You already knew the math, Sergeant. You just weren't sitting still long enough to see all 3 wins." And she walked off the line and left him standing there with the scorecard still crumpled in his fist. A scorecard that an hour ago had been proof of everything he believed and was now proof of nothing at all. That evening in the debrief room, Colonel Hayes pulled up Megan Walker's file for the 3rd time in a week. He had read it before. He'd read it when she'd been assigned to him, and he'd read it again when Miller and 2 of the other senior men had come to his office unofficially off the record to express their concern that a soldier with no combat experience and no field time had been placed in an elite unit on the strength of paper alone. He had understood their concern. He had shared it quietly. A perfect score meant a person could perform on a range with a clock and a clipboard. It said nothing about whether they could perform on the day it mattered, when the wind was wrong and the light was failing, and everyone around them had already given up. Now he read the file a fourth time, and it told him nothing. It hadn't told him before, and that was exactly the problem, because the file could not explain what he had watched today. Scores could be explained, talent could be explained, but there had been a moment out there when she'd let three good shots pass and waited for a window a second and a half wide that had nothing to do with talent. Talent takes the shot. What he'd seen was patience, and patience of that particular kind, the kind that could sit inside its own nerve and refuse to flinch, while 18-year veterans stood behind it, holding their breath. That kind of patience is not trained on a range. It is not taught in 6 weeks or 6 months. It has grown slowly over years in a person who learned very young that the world would not hand them anything, and that the only advantage they would ever have was the willingness to wait longer than everyone else. There was a single line in her file buried in the personal history that he had skimmed past every time before. Father deceased, Thomas Walker, former search and rescue volunteer, Silver Creek, Montana. Hayes read that line for a long time. Then he closed the file and he made a note in the margin of his debrief pad, 3 words, and underlined them twice. Watch this one. He didn't mean it as a warning. He meant it as a promise. The next morning before dawn, Megan was already at the range. She was alone. She was always alone. Not because the others excluded her after yesterday, no one would have dared, but because she had never known any other way. Solitude was not a hardship she endured. It was the water she swam in. Her father had taught her that too, though he'd never said it in so many words. He had simply taken her into the mountains again and again, just the two of them, until the silence stopped being empty and started being full, until she learned to hear the 1,000 small things the world was always saying to anyone patient enough to listen. She was cleaning her rifle when she heard footsteps behind her, and she knew before she turned that it was Reyes, because Reyes walked like a man who had never once in his life tried to be quiet. "You're up early," he said. "So are you." "Yeah, well." He sat down on the bench beside her, gear uninvited, and watched her hands move over the weapon with a familiarity that clearly still amazed him. "Couldn't sleep. Kept running that shot in my head. 3 wins. I've been in this a decade and I never split the wins." He shook his head. "You know what Miller's doing right now? He's out on the East Range with a spotting scope, watching the trees, trying to teach himself to see it. First time I've ever seen that man admit there was something he didn't know." Megan didn't smile, but something in her eased slightly. "Good. Can I ask you something?" "You will anyway." "Why sniper?" Reyes leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You've got the scores to go anywhere. Intelligence, command track. You could have written your own ticket. Why pick the one job where you spend your whole life alone on a hill waiting for a single second that might never come?" Megan set the cleaning rod down. For a moment, it looked like she wasn't going to answer, and Reyes had already started to apologize for prying when she spoke, and her voice was different than he'd heard it, softer and further away, like part of her had left the range and gone somewhere he couldn't follow. "When I was 7, she said, my father took me up the mountain before the sun, and he told me to sit next to him and not talk and not move. 2 hours. I thought we were hunting. We weren't hunting. We didn't bring anything to hunt with." She picked up a cloth, turned it over in her hands. "I was so bored I wanted to cry. And after about an hour, when I'd finally stopped fidgeting and stopped waiting for something to happen, I started to notice things. The way the wind came up the slope before the sun did. The way the birds went quiet a full minute before a hawk showed up. The way you could tell a storm was coming from how the deer stood." She looked at Reyes. "He never told me what the lesson was. He just kept taking me back until I figured it out myself. The world is always talking. Most people are too busy to listen." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "That's beautiful," he said, "but it doesn't answer why sniper." "Doesn't it?" She almost smiled. "It's the only job I've ever heard of where they pay you to sit still and listen." Reyes laughed, and then he stopped laughing because he realized she wasn't joking. "He must be proud of you," he said. "Your dad, watching you out here." And there it was, the thing about Megan Walker, that no file could hold the thing that lived underneath the flat, calm, and the impossible patience, and the shot that had silenced a whole line of veterans. Her hands went still on the rifle. just for a second. And when she answered, her voice did not break because she had learned long ago how to hold it steady, but something moved behind her eyes that made Reyes wish he could take the question back. He passed, she said, the last year of high school, before I enlisted. God, Walker, I'm sorry I didn't. It's all right. And she meant it, or she taught herself to mean it, which after 7 years amounts to nearly the same thing. He didn't get to see any of it, not basic, not the unit, not yesterday. She picked the cleaning rod back up, and her hands were steady again, and her voice was steady again, and only someone watching very closely would have seen what it cost her to make them so. But that's all right too, because everything I did out there yesterday, he taught me. The winds, the waiting, all of it. So in a way, she ran the rod down the barrel slow and sure. In a way, he did take the shot. I just pulled the trigger. Reyes didn't say anything. He had nothing worth saying, and he was smart enough for once to know it. They sat together in the cold dark for a while, neither of them talking, and it was the first time since Megan Walker had joined the unit that anyone had sat with her not to test her, not to doubt her, not to prove something, but simply to be beside her. It would not be the last, because word of the shot was already spreading. By that afternoon, it had traveled up the chain, and by that evening, a name that had been circulating for weeks in a different part of the mountain, the name of a problem no team had been able to solve, was about to collide with Megan Walker's in a way that would test every single thing her father had ever taught her. But that afternoon, before any of that, there was one more conversation. Colonel Hayes called her to his office. She stood at attention in front of his desk, and he let her stand there for a moment while he finished reading something, and then he set it down and looked at her, and he did not offer her a seat, and she did not expect one. Yesterday, he said, that shot. Yes, sir. 3 of my senior men came to me last month and told me you didn't belong here. Off the record. They said you were paper, scores and nothing else. They said the first time the mountain pushed back, you'd fold. He leaned back in his chair. You want to know what I told them? Not especially, sir. Something almost like a smile touched the corner of Hayes's mouth. I told them they were probably right. Megan didn't flinch. Understood, sir. I told them, Hayes went on, that I'd seen 100 perfect scores walk through that door, and I'd seen most of them fold exactly like they said. I told them the range is not the mountain, and the clipboard is not the wind, and there was no way to know, no way at all, until the day the mountain pushed back and we all found out together what you were made of. He stood up. He came around the desk and he stopped in front of her, and he was not a tall man, but there was something in the way he held himself that filled a room. Well, the mountain pushed back yesterday, and now we all know. Sir, so I'm going to tell you the same thing I told them this morning, and I want you to hear it exactly the way I mean it. His voice dropped. You don't have anything left to prove to me. Not the shot, not the wind, not the record. Whatever you did yesterday, you did it clean in front of 8 men who'd already decided you'd fail, and you did it without a word of complaint about how they treated you. That tells me more than the bullet did. He held her eyes. So here's my question, Walker, and I want the truth. Not the file, not the story you tell review boards, the truth. Yes, sir. Can you do it again? And Megan Walker looked at the colonel, who had in the space of a single day gone from doubting her to defending her, and she thought of a cold mountain in Montana and a man who had taught her that skill did not belong to one kind of person, but to anyone willing to work for it, and she gave him the only answer she had ever known how to give. I don't know, sir, she said, but I know how to find out. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and he went back around his desk and he picked up a folder that had been sitting closed at the corner of it the entire time, of a folder she hadn't noticed and now could not stop looking at, and he held it out to her. Then I hope you meant that, he said, because we've got a problem on the North Corridor that 11 men couldn't solve, and after yesterday I'm starting to think the reason they couldn't is that not one of them ever learned how to sit still and listen. Megan took the folder. She did not open it yet. She held it and she felt the weight of it, and somewhere far away, and long ago, a man's voice said the same thing it always said when something hard was coming, the thing he'd told her on 100 cold mornings before the sun. Don't rush it. The mountain's not going anywhere. Wait for the settle. Thank you, sir, she said. And she turned and she walked out of the office with the folder held against her chest. And she did not know yet what was inside it, but she knew the way she'd known about the third band of wind, The way she'd always known the things her father had trained her to know, that whatever it was going to ask her to be everything he'd built her to be. Outside, the light was going. She stood in the cold for a moment, the folder unopened in her hands, and she thought about the question the colonel had asked her on the line, the question Miller had asked, the question that seemed to follow her now everywhere she went. Where did you learn that? She still hadn't answered it, not really, not the whole of it, but she was beginning to understand that before this was over, she was going to have to. She opened the folder, and what she read inside made her go very, very still. The folder held a single name and a body count, not a real body count. This was training, always training, but the numbers on the page had made command stop treating it like training. Over the past 3 weeks on the North Quarter, an unknown shooter had gone up against 11 separate teams in the Army's counter-sniper program, and 11 separate teams had come home with the same report written 11 different ways. We never found him. Megan read the summary twice, and then she read the part that had made her go still, and it was not the number of teams that had failed. It was one line halfway down the second page, entered by a range officer who had clearly not meant for it to sound like what it sounded like. Shooter appears to anticipate team movement before it occurs. She closed the folder. She was still standing outside the colonel's office when Reyes found her, and he took one look at her face and stopped walking. You got the corridor, he said. It wasn't a question. I got the corridor. Walker. He lowered his voice even though there was no one around to hear. I need you to understand something before you go up there. That thing on the North Ridge is not a normal problem. I ran 2 teams against it. 2. And I'm telling you, it's not that he's a good shot. Half the guys up there are good shots. It's that he's already gone, every time. You move your team into position, and by the time you're set, he's not where he was. He's not anywhere. It's like he knew you were coming before you knew you were coming. Nobody knows before you know. That's what I thought, right up until the second exercise when I split my team and sent half of them the long way around specifically so nobody could have called it, and he'd already repositioned to cover the long way around. Reyes shook his head slowly. I didn't tell them the plan until we were in the field. Radio silence. There is no way he heard it, and he covered it anyway. Megan didn't answer right away. She was looking at the folder in her hands, but she wasn't seeing the folder. Then he didn't hear it, she said finally. He predicted it. You can't predict a random split. It wasn't random. She looked up. You just told me you sent half of them the long way around so nobody could call it. But you're a certain kind of man, Reyes. You're aggressive. You like the flanking move. Anybody who's watched you work for 3 weeks would know that if you got frustrated, you try to be clever, and the clever move for that terrain is the long way around. She said it gently, but it landed hard. He didn't read your radio. He read you. Reyes stared at her. That's worse, he said. That's so much worse than what I thought. By 0600 the next morning, Megan Walker was standing in a briefing room in front of Colonel Hayes Sergeant Miller Reyes, and 2 others she'd been assigned a spotter named Diaz, who talked too much, and a young corporal named Pierce, who barely talked at all, and she was about to do something that made every man in the room lean back in his chair. She was refusing the mission as briefed. Say that again, Hayes said. I don't want a team, sir. Miller made a sound in his throat. Here we go. You just gave a rookie the assignment 11 teams couldn't solve. Miller went on, and her first move is to tell you she wants us to solve it with fewer people. Colonel, with respect, this is exactly the kind of thing I... Let her finish. Megan didn't wait to be told twice. 11 teams have failed the same way. He watched them move, he read their intentions off how they moved, and he was gone before they got set. The problem isn't that they weren't good. The problem is that a team is loud, not with sound, with behavior. 5 men make 5 men's worth of decisions, and every decision is a piece of information. He's been reading those pieces for 3 weeks. She set the folder down on the table. I don't want to give him pieces. So you go alone, Hayes said. I go with 1 spotter and nobody else. And the spotter doesn't call anything on the radio. We don't move like a team. We don't think like a team. We give him nothing to read. The room was quiet. Then Miller laughed, but it was a different laugh than the one from the range, and everyone heard the difference. You know what the worst part is, he said. The worst part is she might be right. He turned to Hayes. I hate that she might be right. Hayes looked at Megan for a long moment. Who's your spotter? And this was the moment, because Megan Walker looked around the room past Diaz, who wanted it past Pierce, who was too new past Reyes, who had already run against the corridor twice and lost. And she settled on the one man in that room who had called her a paper soldier in front of the whole unit. "Sergeant Miller," she said. Miller's head came up. "Excuse me. You've spent 18 years learning to see things I can't. Yesterday you told me you went out on the East Range and you tried to teach yourself the winds. A man who does that when nobody's watching is a man I want next to me when everything's watching." She held his eyes. "I don't need someone who agrees with me as sergeant. I need someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong. You've already proven you'll do that in front of a whole unit. So, will you spot for me?" Nobody in that room had ever seen James Miller lost for words. He found them eventually. "You're asking the man who called you paper to watch your back. I'm asking the best spotter in this unit to watch my back. The paper thing was your problem. I don't have time for it." For a second, it looked like he might refuse out of pure stubbornness. Then something in his face shifted, some old things settling into place. And when he spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the contempt it had carried the day before. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I'll spot for you." Hayes stood. "Then it is settled. You have 72 hours. He looked between the two of them. "Walker, one more thing. 11 teams went up there and came home empty, and not one of them got a single confirmed sighting. Not one. If you two go up there and come home the same way, this stops being a story about a rookie who made a good shot. It becomes a story about a rookie who talked her sergeant into a fool's errand. You understand what I'm telling you?" "You're telling me not to miss," Megan said. "I'm telling you not to miss." They went up the corridor that afternoon. It was maybe 40 minutes into the climb with Miller a few paces behind her, and neither of them speaking when he finally said the thing he'd been chewing on since the briefing room. "Can I ask you something and you not take it wrong?" "You can ask." "Yesterday, the shot. And now this, the way you read Reyes, the way you called the whole thing in about 30 seconds. He adjusted the weight on his shoulders. "I've been doing this since before you could drive Walker. And I've never met anybody your age who reads people the way you read the terrain. Most kids your age can't read a room, let alone a sniper they've never seen. Where's that come from? And don't tell me the math. I've had enough of the math." Megan walked a few more steps before she answered. "My father," she said, "spent 20 years pulling people off mountains. Search and rescue. Volunteer. Never took a dime for it. And the thing about search and rescue that people don't understand is that most of the job isn't the climbing or the ropes or any of it. Again, only the job is figuring out where a lost person went. And you can't ask them because they're lost. So you learn to read them from what they left behind." Her voice had gone somewhere quieter. He used to stand at a trailhead where somebody had gone missing, and he'd close his eyes and he'd say, "All right, this is a 50-year-old man, came alone, drove a nice car, wore new boots." And then he'd say, "That man is scared of looking foolish. So when the trail got hard, he didn't turn back because turning back means admitting he made a mistake. He went down. Every time. Check the ravines." And he'd be right. He'd be right. So often the county started calling him before they called anybody else. Miller had stopped walking. He read lost people, he said slowly, off what kind of boots they wore. He read lost people off everything. And when I was a kid, before I even understood what he was doing, I'd stand next to him at those trailheads and I'd listen to him think out loud. She started walking again. "You asked where I learned to read a sniper I've never met. That's where. I learned it standing next to a man who could tell you which way a stranger ran just from the car they drove there in. A sniper is easier than a lost hiker, Sergeant. A lost hiker doesn't want to be found. A sniper wants you to come to him. That's a tell all by itself." They didn't talk for a while after that. They set up before dark, and this was where the 72 hours truly began, and it began with nothing happening at all. For the entire first day, they did not move. Diaz, back at the base, had bet money they'd have contact by nightfall. He lost that bet. Megan and Miller sat in one position from before dawn to after dark and did not fire a shot, did not call a target, did not so much as shift their weight more than necessary. And by the afternoon, Miller had begun to understand what she was doing, and it made the hair stand up on his arms. "You're not hunting him," he whispered somewhere in the long dead middle of the day. "No, you're letting him hunt us. You want him to come looking. 11 teams went looking for him and found nothing. So I'm not going to look for him." She hadn't moved her eye from the scope in 2 hours. I'm going to make him wonder why we're not looking. A team that doesn't move is a team he can't read. And a sniper who can't read the other mean a pause gets curious. Curiosity makes you move. And the second he moves, he stops being a ghost and starts being a man on a mountain. Miller looked at her for a long moment. You planned this in the briefing room, he said, before you even knew the terrain. You planned to do nothing. I planned to make him do something. Same thing from the other side. Night came and they held. Day 2 began and they held, and it was the middle of day 2, with both of them running on almost no sleep and less water than they'd have liked, that the first real thing happened. Miller saw it before she did. Walker. His voice was so low it was almost nothing. 2 o'clock. Mid-slope. Something just moved that shouldn't have. Megan didn't jerk toward it. That was the first thing that told Miller she was the real article. A lesser shooter would have swung the rifle, and the movement would have given them away. She simply shifted her eyes slow patient and looked where he was looking. I see it, she breathed. Is that him? No. What do you mean no? There's nothing else up here that's got to be. It's a deer. Her voice never changed. Look at the rhythm. Whatever moved is grazing. Head down, head up, head down. A man doesn't move like that. He's telling us it's clear. Miller let out a slow breath. You almost had me calling that in. That's why we don't call anything in. He wants us to react to the deer. A deer moving calm means no predator around, and he knows we know that, so he lets the deer graze right where we'll see it, hoping we relax. Her jaw tightened just slightly. He's smart. He's using the mountain against us. Everything on this slope is a message if you know how to read it, and he's writing them for us. So what do? We write one back. And here was where the whole thing turned, where the 72-hour standoff stopped from being a waiting game and became something closer to a conversation between two people who had never seen each other's faces. Megan told Miller to move, not to reposition, to move badly, to break a branch on the way, to let his silhouette show for half a second against the ridgeline, to do all the things a tired, sloppy, frustrated team does on day 2 when its patience runs out. To pretend, in other words, to be exactly the kind of team the shooter had beaten 11 times. You want me to give us away, Miller said flatly. I want you to give away a team that's given up. There's a difference. He's beaten 11 teams that broke on day 2. He knows what a broken team looks like. So we're going to show him one, and we're going to make it beautiful, and he's going to believe it because it's exactly what he's been waiting 3 weeks to see. She finally pulled back from the scope and looked at him. And when he believes we're broken, he'll move to take the shot. Because a broken team is a target, not a threat. That's the moment. That's the second and a half. That's the settle. Miller stared at her. You are, he said slowly, either the best I've ever worked with or the craziest. And I genuinely cannot tell which. My father used to say those are usually the same person. Miller moved. He was good at it, good enough to make bad look real, which is harder than it sounds, and he broke the branch and showed the silhouette and did all the small, ugly things a beaten man does. And then he settled back into cover next to Megan, and the two of them waited, and this was the longest wait of the entire 72 hours, because now there was no more strategy left. There was only whether she'd read the man right. 20 minutes passed. 30. He's not buying it, Miller whispered. He's buying it. He's just careful. A careful man doesn't take the bait the second he smells it. He waits to make sure it's real. How long? As long as it takes, 40 minutes. And Miller had just opened his mouth to say something when Megan's whole body changed, not a large movement, just a settling, a stillness dropping over her like a held breath, and he knew without being told. There, she breathed. Upper slope. He moved. He's setting up on where he thinks you exposed yourself. He believes it. You see him. I see where he has to be. Same as the map. He can't take the shot you baited from where he was. He has to move to a firing position that covers your silhouette, and there's exactly one on this slope that has the angle and the cover both. Her voice dropped even lower. He's moving to it right now. He thinks he's about to shoot a broken sergeant. He doesn't know the sergeant was the bait. How long till he's set? Seconds. And then for the first time in the entire mission, Megan Walker's certainty cracked. Miller felt it more than saw it, a hesitation, a held breath that went a beat too long. And he did the thing a spotter does, the thing that mattered more than any shot. Talk to me, he said. What's wrong? The wind just shifted. Her voice was tight. It came up the slope early, before the sun cleared the ridge. That shouldn't happen for another 20 minutes. The thermal cycle's off. Something's wrong with the read. Then don't take it. If I don't take it in the next 4 seconds, he's set and we lose him for another 3 weeks and 11 teams becomes 12. Walker. Miller's voice was iron. Listen to me. You told me yesterday you shoot the settle, not the gust. If the wind is wrong, the wind is wrong. Don't you take a shot you can't make just because the clock's running. That's how good shooters die. Wait for the settle. And in that second, kneeling on a mountain with a ghost about to become solid in her crosshairs, and the wind coming up wrong, and everything her father ever taught her, hanging in the balance. Megan Walker heard two voices at once. Miller's telling her to wait, and her father's from a cold morning, 20 years gone, saying the exact same words. Wait for the settle. The mountain's not going anywhere. She waited. She let the shot go. The one she'd worked 72 hours to earn, she let it pass because the wind was wrong, and a mile away, a man she'd never met finished settling into his firing position, and Miller's stomach dropped because he thought she'd frozen, thought he'd talked her out of the only chance they'd get. Walker. He's set, she said, very calm now. He thinks he's about to take the shot, which means for the next few seconds, he's completely focused on you. On the bait. He's not thinking about us anymore. He's not reading us. For the first time in 3 weeks, that man is not paying attention to anything except a silhouette that isn't even there. The wind up the slope gusted, bent the trees, and then for one breath went still. There's a settle, she fired. The sound rolled off the corridor and came back, and for 3 long seconds, there was nothing the same, nothing that had come after the shot on the range, and Miller had his scope on the upper slope, and he saw it before the radio said it. Hit, he said, and his voice didn't sound like his own. That's a hit, confirmed. He's down. That's a clean hit He checked the range and swore softly. At a distance I would have told you was impossible on a good day, with a good wind, and you did it on a bad wind. You called yourself off a bait you designed against a ghost that beat 11 teams. He lowered the scope and looked at her. Walker, what in God's name are you? Megan didn't answer. She pulled back from the rifle and she did the thing she always did, the thing that undid people more than the shooting. She started calmly to pack her equipment. But this time her hands were not quite steady, and Miller saw it, and he understood that the woman who never seemed to feel anything felt all of it and simply refused to let it move her hands until the work was done. You okay? He asked quietly. I let the first shot go, she said. I could have taken it. He was set. If you hadn't told me to wait, I'd have rushed the bad wind, and I'd have missed, and he'd have killed the bait, and we'd be Team 12. She latched the case. You saved this mission, Sergeant, not me. You did what a spotter's supposed to do. You told me the truth when I didn't want to hear it. Miller was quiet for a moment. 2 days ago, I called you paper in front of the whole unit, he said. And now you're up here telling me I saved the mission. He shook his head slowly. I've never been so wrong about a person in my life. And I've been doing this 18 years, Walker. That's a lot of years to be that wrong. You weren't wrong, you just didn't have enough information. She stood shoulder to her case. You saw scores and no combat, and you drew a conclusion. That was a reasonable conclusion. It just happened to be wrong because the thing you couldn't see on my file was the 20 years I spent on a mountain before I ever picked up an army rifle. She looked at him. My father used to say the same thing about lost hikers. You never judge where a person went by where you'd have gone. You judge it by who they are. You just didn't know who I was yet. They came down the corridor together as the light was going. And the story of what happened up there traveled faster than they did. By the time they reached the base, Diaz was already telling everyone who'd listen that the rookie had gone up against the ghost with one spotter and taken it in 2 days, and the story had already grown in the telling, and Reyes met them at the bottom with an expression Megan had never seen on him. Is it true, Reyes said. You baited him, you baited the ghost. You made Miller pretend to break so the guy would move to shoot him and expose himself. It was Miller's idea to wait on the wind, Megan said. That's the part that mattered. It was her plan to start to finish, Miller said. Don't let her give it to me. I called the wind. She built the whole thing. I've been doing this longer than she's been alive, and I couldn't have designed what she designed. I want that on the record. Reyes looked between them, and something dawned on his face because Reyes was not a stupid man, and he could see what was standing in front of him. The sergeant who had wanted the rookie gone was now insisting the rookie get the credit, and that transformation was almost as remarkable as the shot itself. "Colonel wants to see you," Reyes said. "Both of you now." Hayes was standing when they came in, and he did not let them stand at attention long. "Sit," he said. "Both of you. That's not a request." They sat. 11 teams, Hayes said. 3 weeks, not one confirmed sighting between them. And you two went up there and closed it in 2 days with a plan I still don't fully understand. He looked at Megan. "Walk me through it, slow, because I've got to write this up, and right now the report just says the rookie solved the unsolvable, and Command's going to want to know how, and Paper Soldier is not going to cut it anymore." So she walked him through it. The refusal of the team, the single spotter, the 2 days of doing nothing to give him nothing to read, the deer that wasn't a threat, the bait that made Miller look broken, the bad wind and the past shot and the settle. When she finished, Hayes was quiet for a long time. "You designed a plan," he finally said, "around the psychology of a man you'd never met. You beat him not because you outshot him, but because you outthought him. You read a stranger off 11 after-action reports the way most people read a road sign." He leaned forward. "That is not a marksmanship skill, Walker. I've got marksmen coming out of my ears. That's something else. And I've been sitting here for 2 days trying to figure out what to call it, and I keep coming back to the same word, and I don't like it because it's not a word we use for 25-year-old corporals." "What word, Sir?" Miller asked. Hayes looked at him. "Instinct." He turned back to Megan. "The kind veterans spend a whole career trying to build, and mostly never do. You walked in the door with it. That doesn't come from the Army. It doesn't come from a range." His eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but with something closer to wonder. "It comes from somewhere else, and I think it's about time you told me where." And this was the moment the whole thing had been building toward, the question that had followed her from the range to the corridor to this office, the question Hayes had first asked her with binoculars still warm in his hands. "Where did you learn that?" Megan looked at the colonel. She looked at Miller, the man who had called her paper, and then insisted she take the credit. And something in her, some door she had kept shut since a funeral 7 years ago, opened just a little. "My father," she said, "was named Thomas Walker. He was a search and rescue volunteer in a town in Montana you've never heard of. He never served. He never fired a weapon at anything but a target in his life. And he was the best reader of terrain and people I have ever known or ever will." Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a wall holding back water. "Everything I did on that mountain he taught me before I was 15. Not the shooting, the seeing, the waiting, the reading. He used to take me to trailheads where people had gone missing and teach me to figure out where they'd run just from the car they drove there in." "Where is he now?" Hayes asked gently, though something in Megan's voice had already told him the answer. "He died," she said, "in my senior year of high school, before I enlisted." She held the colonel's eyes, and she did not let her voice break, because she had promised herself a long time ago that she would not let it break in front of the Army, that this one thing would stay hers. "He never saw any of it, sir. He never saw me enlist. He never saw the unit. He never saw the shot on the range or the corridor or any of it. Everything I am up on that mountain he built, and he never got to watch a single piece of it work." The office was very quiet. Miller was looking at the floor. Hayes was looking at Megan, and the wonder had gone out of his face and been replaced by something older and quieter, the look of a man who has just understood that the extraordinary thing sitting across from him was grown out of an ordinary grief, the way the hardest steel comes out of the hottest fire. "Corporal Walker," Hayes said, "I'm going to tell you something, and then I'm going to end this meeting because I think you've earned some rest." He folded his hands. "I've commanded elite soldiers for 11 years. I've handed out more commendations than I can count, and I've buried more men than I'd like to. And in all that time, I have never once written a report that said a soldier's greatest weapon was a dead man from Montana who never wore a uniform." He paused. "I'm going to write that report today, because it's true, and because that man deserves to have it written down somewhere official that he built one of the finest instincts I have ever seen in a soldier, and he did it with nothing but patience and a mountain and a little girl who was willing to sit still and listen." Megan didn't say anything. She couldn't quite. "Dismissed," Hayes said more gently than he'd ever said anything. "Both of you, get some sleep. You earned it. They walked out together, Megan and Miller, into the last of the light. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Miller stopped and Megan stopped with him, and the sergeant, who had called her paper, looked at her with an expression that had traveled a very long way in 72 hours. "I owe you an apology," he said, "a real one, not the half one I gave you on the range. I looked at your file and I decided who you were, and I was wrong in every direction it's possible to be wrong. And the reason I was wrong," his jaw worked, "the reason I was wrong is I did exactly what your father told you never to do. I judged where you'd go by where I'd have gone. I looked at a young woman with no combat, and I saw myself at that age, and I knew what I couldn't do at that age, and I put that on you." He shook his head. "I never once stopped to ask who you actually were." Megan looked at him for a long moment. "He'd have liked you," she said finally. "Who?" "My father. He'd have liked you, not right away. He'd have thought you were stubborn and proud and too sure of yourself." A ghost of something crossed her face, almost a smile. "But he'd have liked you because when you were wrong, you said so, out loud, in front of people. He always said that was the rarest thing in the world. Anybody can be right. It takes a real man to be wrong on purpose out loud where it costs him something." She held out her hand. "We're square, Sergeant. Get some sleep." Miller looked at the offered hand. Then he took it and he shook it, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with the strange, hard respect that only comes from being proven completely wrong by someone you'd written off. "You know they're going to keep coming to you now," he said, still holding her hand. "The impossible ones. The problems nobody can solve. You closed the corridor and you did it in 2 days, and command is going to remember that. They're going to save the worst ones for you now. You understand that you just made yourself the person they call when there is no good answer." Megan let go of his hand. "I know," she said quietly. And then so quietly he almost missed it. So quietly it might have been meant only for a man in Montana who couldn't hear it anymore. "That's what he trained me for." She turned and walked toward the barracks, and Miller stood and watched her go. And for the first time in 18 years, James Miller found himself grateful to have been the most wrong he had ever been about anything in his life. Because the woman walking away from him was not paper. She never had been. She was something the Army had no word for, something grown on a mountain by a man who would never know it had worked, and Miller understood now, watching her disappear into the dusk, that he had not just witnessed a great soldier. He had witnessed a great teacher's greatest lesson, still walking, still working, still winning 7 years after the teacher was gone. Miller was right about the impossible ones. He was right sooner than either of them expected. 9 days after they came down off the corridor, Colonel Hayes called Megan back to his office, and this time the folder on his desk was thicker, and this time he did not slide it across to her. He kept his hand flat on top of it like he wasn't sure he wanted to let it go. "Before I open it," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as a warning and not a compliment. What you did on the corridor made noise. The good kind and the bad kind." He tapped the folder. "The good kind is that command now knows your name. The bad kind is that command now knows your name." "I don't follow, sir." "You will." He opened the folder. "There's a man named General Aldous Crane, 3 stars. He runs the evaluation program that funds this unit and about everything else on this mountain. And General Crane has a theory about soldiers like you." Hayes's jaw tightened. "His theory is that people who score perfect on paper and then perform once under controlled conditions are, and I'm quoting him now, statistical noise. Flukes. He believes real capability shows up over time under his conditions on his tests. And he has decided personally to come here and prove that your corridor result was luck." Megan didn't move. "When tomorrow, 0800, he's bringing his own scenario, his own evaluators, and his own conclusion already written." Hayes looked at her steadily. "I want you to understand what that means. This isn't a training exercise you can win by being good. He's not coming here to find out if you're the real thing. He's coming here to prove you're not in front of every officer on this base so he can shut down the kind of fast-track promotion that put you in this unit. You are not the target, Walker. You're just the example he's chosen to make." For a moment, Megan was quiet. Then she asked the only question that mattered to her. "What's the scenario?" "He won't tell me. That's the point. He wants you cold, no prep, no read on the terrain, nothing." Hayes closed the folder. "He wants to take away every advantage you have and see what's left." And Megan Walker, who had spent 72 hours on a mountain taking away another man's advantages one by one, understood exactly what was being done to her, and understood too that it was the smartest possible move against her because everything she was good at required time, and Crane had just decided to give her none. "Sir," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why does a three-star general care this much about one corporal? There are perfect scores all over the army." "Why me? Why come himself?" Hayes was quiet for a moment, and then he did something that surprised her. He sat down and he rubbed his face with both hands, and when he looked up, he looked older than he had a minute ago. "Because you're not moved first," he said. "4 years ago, there was another one. Different unit, different mountain. A young shooter scores off the chart, fast-tracked past a lot of people who'd waited years." Crane didn't like it then either. He ran that soldier through a scenario a lot like the one you're about to face, and the soldier failed badly in front of everyone, and it ended a career before it started. Hayes's voice was flat. Crane's been running that same play ever since. He finds the fast-tracked ones, he engineers a public failure, and he uses it to argue that the whole system of promoting on merit instead of time is broken. He's built a reputation on it, and now he's found you. Then he's beaten this before. Every time. Because every soldier he's done it to made the same mistake. They tried to prove they belong. They got angry, they pushed, they tried to be impressive, and impressive is exactly what he's waiting for. He wants you to reach. The second you reach, you're his. Hayes leaned forward. "Walker, I've watched you now, on the range and on the corridor. And the one thing you have never once done is reach. You wait. You let the other man move first. That's the only reason I think you might survive tomorrow. But I won't lie to you, he's beaten better prepared soldiers than you, and he's had 4 years to make this trap perfect." Megan stood there and absorbed it, and something moved behind her eyes, something Hayes had not seen there before, not on the range and not on the corridor. "Sir," she said, "the soldier 4 years ago, the one whose career ended. Do you know his name?" Hayes hesitated. "Why?" "Because a man doesn't build his whole reputation on breaking young soldiers unless it's personal. You don't hunt the same prey for 4 years over a policy disagreement. Something happened 4 years ago that made this about more than fast-tracking for General Crane. And if I'm going to walk into his scenario cold, I'd like to know what I'm actually standing in the middle of." Hayes looked at her for a long, long moment, and then he understood that he had just watched her do it again. Write a man she'd never met off a single folder, find the loose thread and pull. "His name," Hayes said slowly, "was Daniel Crane." The office went very still. "The general's son," Megan said. "His son, who scored perfect, got fast-tracked and washed out of a scenario his own father didn't design, but happened to be present for. Daniel left the army. It wasn't good what happened to Daniel afterward. The general has never spoken about it. But everyone who knows the story knows that ever since Aldous Crane has made it his personal mission to prove that the system that built up his son and then broke him is fundamentally flawed. That fast promotion is cruelty dressed up as opportunity. That every kid it lifts up, it's just setting up to fall." Hayes met her eyes. "So no, Walker. You're right. It's not about policy. He's not trying to prove the system is broken. He's trying to prove it killed his son. And you're the next kid it lifted up." Megan was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. It was quieter, and there was something in it Hayes hadn't heard before, something almost gentle. "He's not hunting me, sir," she said. "He's grieving. That doesn't make him less dangerous. No, it makes him more dangerous, and it makes him something else too." She looked at the folder on the desk. "It makes him a lost man at a trailhead. And I know how to find those." She did not sleep much that night, but she did not spend the night the way Crane would have expected. She did not run the range. She did not review scenarios or study terrain or try to guess what the general would throw at her. She lay on her bunk in the dark, and she thought about a man in Montana, and she thought about grief, and she thought about the difference between a person who wants to beat you and a person who needs to be right about something that has nothing to do with you. At 0740 the next morning, she stood on the evaluation range and watched General Aldous Crane arrive. He was older than she'd pictured and smaller, and he moved like a man carrying something heavy that no one else could see. He had a hard, closed face and eyes that swept the range once and found her immediately and dismissed her just as fast, and that dismissal told Megan more than an hour of conversation would have. He had already decided how this ended. She was not a person to him. She was a demonstration. He walked past her without a word up to the evaluation platform, and only then did he turn and speak, and he spoke to the assembled officers, not to her. For those unfamiliar with my work, Crane said, I'll be brief. This unit fast-tracked a corporal on the strength of test scores and a single field result. I'm here to determine whether that result reflects genuine capability or statistical noise. The scenario I've designed removes the variables the corporal has previously relied upon. No advanced study of terrain, no time to prepare, no spotter of her choosing. His eyes finally came to Megan. Corporal Walker will demonstrate her capability under real conditions, or she will demonstrate its absence. Either outcome serves the Army. Are you ready, Corporal? Yes, sir, Megan said. You don't want to ask what the scenario is. You'll tell me when you want me to know, sir. Something flickered across Crane's face, annoyance maybe, or the first small recognition that this one was not going to reach the way the others had. He'd wanted a question. A question was a reach. A calm corporal who didn't ask was a corporal who wasn't panicking, and panic was the soil his whole method grew in. The scenario, he said, is simple. There is a target on this range. You will locate it and engage it. You have 30 minutes. You will be assigned a spotter, but you have selected not one you know. He gestured and a soldier stepped forward, a young corporal Megan had never seen, stiff and nervous and clearly terrified to be standing next to a 3-star general. Corporal Ellis will spot for you. He arrived this morning. You've never worked together. You have no shared signals, no shared language, nothing. Just as it would be if you were dropped into a unit mid-crisis. Crane's mouth thinned into something that wasn't a smile. Begin when ready. And Megan understood in one clean flash exactly what the trap was. It was not the terrain, and it was not the target, and it was not the 30-minute clock. It was the boy standing next to her. Crane had given her a spotter. She'd never worked with a nervous kid with no shared language. And the whole scenario was built on the assumption that she would either ignore him and work alone, which would look arrogant, which would look like a soldier who thought she was above needing help, or try to work with him and fail, because you cannot build trust with a stranger in 30 minutes under a general's eye. Every soldier before her had chosen one of those two roads. Ignore the spotter and look arrogant. Rely on the spotter and fail. Crane had built a scenario with only losing moves. So Megan Walker did the thing her father had taught her to do when there were no good moves on the board. She changed what game she was playing. Corporal Ellis, she said, and she said it gently because the kid was shaking. Look at me. Not the general. Me. Ellis's eyes came to her. I know you've never done this with me. I know you're scared. I know he picked you because you're new, and you'll make mistakes, and he's counting on those mistakes to sink us both. She kept her voice low and even. So here's what we're going to do. You're not going to try to be a great spotter. You're going to do exactly one thing, and you're going to do it well, and I'll handle the rest. Can you do one thing? Ellis swallowed. One thing. Yes, ma'am. I think so. Not think. I need to know. Yes, ma'am. One thing. Good. Here's your one thing. You watch the flags. There were range flags at intervals downrange standard equipment. You don't call wind. You don't call distance. You don't call anything technical because you and I don't share a language for that yet, and we'll just confuse each other. All you do is tell me in plain words what the flags are doing. Are they lifting? Are they dropping? Are they still? That's it. A 10-year-old could do it. You just tell me what you see in the plainest words you've got, and you don't stop talking, and you don't second-guess yourself, and you let me do the math. Understand? And something happened in the young corporal's face, something Crane, watching from the platform, did not expect and did not like. The terror went out of it, because Megan had just taken an impossible job and cut it down to a possible one, and a scared kid who has been given one clear thing he can actually do is no longer a scared kid. I can do that, ma'am, Ellis said, and he meant it. I know you can. That's why I picked it. She turned to her rifle. Talk to me, Ellis. Start now. Don't wait for the target. Just tell me what the flags are doing so I learn your voice. And this was the move Crane had not planned for, the move that made Hayes, watching from the side, lean forward with something like awe. Every other soldier had treated the stranger spotter as a handicap to overcome. Megan had treated him as a person to lead. She wasn't going to build trust with Ellis in 30 minutes. She was going to make trust unnecessary by giving him a job so simple it required none. Ellis started talking, awkward at first, then smoother, describing the flags in the plainest words he had. Left flag's lifting, middle ones kinda limp, barely moving. Far one's snapping hard, ma'am, really whipping. Good. Keep going. Don't stop. And Megan listened. She did the thing she'd done her whole life, the thing her father built into her before she was 15. She took 100 small pieces of information and assembled them into a picture. The far flag whipping, while the middle one hung limp, told her the same thing the trees on Raven Ridge had told her weeks ago. Multiple wind bands, different speeds at different distances. She wasn't getting technical wind calls from Ellis. She didn't need them. She was getting raw observation from a kid too new to filter it, and raw observation was worth more than a nervous expert's polished guess. Where's the target, ma'am? Ellis whispered. I don't see a target. Neither do I. That's fine. Keep watching the flags. 6 minutes into the 30, Megan still had not found the target, and up on the platform, Crane checked his watch, and the thin thing that wasn't a smile touched his mouth again. This was the part where they panicked. This was the part where the clock got into their heads and they started sweeping the rifle wildly, looking, reaching, and the reach was where he took them. But Megan wasn't looking for the target. Ellis, she said quietly, I want you to stop looking at the flags for a second and tell me something. When you set up the range this morning, you helped set it up, didn't you? You said you arrived this morning. Ellis blinked. Yes, ma'am. They had me help stage the equipment, but I wasn't told anything about the scenario. I swear I don't know where the ground. I'm not asking you to break the scenario. I'd never ask you that. I'm asking something else. Her voice stayed low under the wind where the platform couldn't hear. When you staged the equipment, was there anywhere they told you not to go? Anywhere that was off limits? A section they kept you away from? Ellis went still. Ma'am, he whispered, I can't. That would be... You're right. Don't answer. And here was the thing that separated Megan Walker from every soldier who had walked into this trap before her. She did not need him to answer. His stillness had already answered. The place he wasn't allowed to go was the place the target was. She had found it without making him break a single rule, without asking him to betray anything, using nothing but the shape of his fear. Forget I asked. Watch the flags. You're doing great. She swung the scope slow and patient to the one section of the range Ellis's silence had circled for her. And there it was. Not obvious. Deliberately hidden, tucked into a fold of ground where no soldier scanning at random would think to look a target designed to eat the whole 30 minutes in fruitless searching. But she wasn't scanning at random. She had read the range off a nervous boy's hesitation the same way her father read a missing hiker off the car he drove. I have the target, she said, 9 minutes in. On the platform, Crane's watch hand froze halfway to his pocket. Ellis, the flags, all three. Right now, plain words go. Left still lifting, middle's dead calm, ma'am, nothing. Far one just dropped it, went slack, it's settling. The far flag settling. The far band letting go. The wind at the target going still. And Megan Walker heard her father's voice one more time on one more mountain saying the words he always said, and she squeezed the trigger in the second and a half the boy's plain words had handed her. The shot rolled down the range, and the confirmation came almost at once, because at this range there was no long agonizing wait. There was just a spotter downrange with a radio, and the radio said the words that turned General Aldous Crane's entire 4-year campaign to dust. Impact. Center. Clean hit. 11 minutes, she'd had 30. Nobody on that range moved. Crane stood on his platform with his watch still in his hand, and the officers he'd assembled to witness a rookie's failure stood in a silence that was slowly terribly curdling into something he had not brought them here to feel. Respect. For her. And underneath the respect, the first cold question about him, about a 3-star general who had built a scenario with only losing moves and lost anyway. And then Ellis, the terrified boy Crane had chosen as a weapon, did the bravest thing anyone did that day. He turned to the general, and in a voice that shook but did not stop, he said, Sir, for the record, she didn't ask me to break the scenario, not once. I want that on the record. Whatever you write about this, she never once asked me to cheat. She made my part small enough that I could do it. That's all she did, sir. She made my part small enough. Crane looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he looked at Megan, and he came down off the platform slowly, and he crossed the range to where she stood, and every officer present held their breath. Because this was the moment, this was where the general either found a technicality to void the result or admitted in front of everyone that he had lost. He did neither. He stopped in front of her, and up close his face was not the hard, closed thing it had been. It was the face of a tired old man, and his eyes were doing something complicated, and when he spoke it was very quietly, so quietly that only she could hear. "How did you find the target?" "I read your spotter, sir." "He told you nothing?" "No, sir. He didn't. That's exactly how I read him. There was one part of the range he wouldn't talk about, so that's where I looked." She held his eyes, and she did not gloat, and she did not press her advantage, because her father had taught her that you never crowd a lost man. Once you've found him, you bring him in slow. "He never broke your scenario, sir. He's a good soldier. He just told me without meaning to where he wasn't allowed to go. That's not his fault. That's just what fear does. It points at the thing it's hiding." Crane was quiet. "You had 30 minutes, he said. You used 11. "Yes, sir." "Every other soldier I've run through a scenario like this used all 30 and failed. They spent the whole time looking." His voice was strange now, thick. "You spent 9 minutes not looking, and then you looked once in the right place and you were done. Why weren't you looking like the others?" And Megan Walker understood that this was not really a question about the range at all. Hayes had told her the story, and she had turned it over all night, and she knew now that the man in front of her was not asking how she'd found the target. He was asking why she hadn't failed the way his son had. He was asking what she had that Daniel didn't. He was, without knowing he was doing it, asking her to tell him it wasn't the system that killed his boy. She could have said many things. She could have defended the fast track. She could have argued policy. But her father hadn't taught her to win arguments. He'd taught her to find lost people, and she'd finally found the one standing in front of her. "Sir," she said gently, "can I tell you something, and can you hear it not as a corporal talking back to a general, but just as one person telling another the truth?" Crane's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I wasn't looking like the others," she said, "because I wasn't afraid like the others. And I want to be honest with you about why, because I think you already know, and I think you've carried it a long time." She lowered her voice further, so it stayed between them. "You built this scenario to have no good moves. Ignore the spotter and look arrogant. Trust the spotter and fail. A clock that eats you alive. There's no way to win it by being good, sir. You built it that way on purpose. And every soldier who ever walked into it felt that there was no way out, and that feeling is what beat them. Not the terrain, not the target, the trap." She paused. "It's a beautiful trap, sir. It's the most carefully built thing I've ever seen. And I think you built it because somewhere in you, you believe that's what happened. That someone got put in a scenario with no good moves, and it wasn't his fault, and he lost anyway, and it broke him. And you've been building that same trap for 4 years to prove it wasn't his fault. To prove the trap was real." The range had gone utterly silent. Crane's face had not moved, but something behind it had. "You're out of line, Corporal," he said. But there was no force in it. "Yes, sir, I know. And I'll take whatever comes for it." She held his eyes. "But I found my way out of your trap today, sir, and I need you to understand how, because I think it's the thing you've needed someone to say for 4 years. I didn't beat the trap by being braver or better than the soldiers who came before me. I beat it because I had a father who spent my whole childhood teaching me that when there are no good moves, you stop playing the game they built and you play a different one. That's not talent, sir. That's not a perfect score. Somebody gave me that. Somebody spent years building it into me before the army ever got its hands on me." Her voice was steady and gentle and unbearably kind. "The soldiers who failed your scenario didn't fail because the system lifted them up too fast. They failed because nobody ever taught them how to get out of a trap with no good moves. That's not a flaw in the system, sir. That's just a thing that has to be taught. And if nobody taught it to them," she stopped, and then she said the last of it as softly as she'd ever said anything, "then that's not the fault of the boy who never learned it. And it's not the fault of the man who didn't know he was supposed to teach it. It's nobody's fault, sir. It's just a thing that got missed." For a long moment, Aldous Crane did not move at all. And then this hard old general, this 3-star who had come to a mountain to break a rookie in front of 100 officers, closed his eyes, and something went out of his shoulders. Some weight he had been carrying so long, He'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. And when he opened his eyes again, they were wet, and he did not care who saw. His name was Daniel, Crane said. I know, sir. He was 24. The general's voice was barely there. And I was so proud of him and so afraid for him. And when they fast-tracked him, I thought they were setting him up. I thought they were going to lift him up and then let him fall. And when he failed, when it broke him, boy, he stopped. He could not finish it. I've spent 4 years proving the system did it, building the trap over and over, watching kid after kid fall into it, telling myself each one proved it wasn't his fault. It wasn't his fault, sir. You just told me it was nobody's fault. That's right. Megan's voice did not waver. It wasn't the system's fault, and it wasn't Daniel's fault. And sir, she said it so gently that it barely landed, and yet it landed like a hammer. It wasn't yours either. It was just a thing that got missed, a thing nobody knew to teach him. And you've spent 4 years trying to figure out who to blame so it would stop hurting, and the answer you've been running from is that there's no one to blame, and that's the hardest answer there is, because it means you can't fix it by winning. You can only fix it by putting it down. The general stood there in front of 100 witnesses, and Megan Walker watched 4 years of grief and rage and self-punishment stand in the balance, and she did the last thing her father had taught her. The thing that came after you found the lost person. She stopped talking, and she let him find his own way in, because a person brought in by force never truly comes home. Crane looked at her for a long, long time. You're a remarkable soldier, Corporal Walker, he finally said, and his voice had steadied, and something in his face had changed in a way that would not change back. But that's not the remarkable thing about you, is it? Anyone can shoot. You walked into a trap I spent 4 years perfecting, and instead of fighting your way out, you reached down and pulled the man who built it out with you. He shook his head slowly. Where does a person learn to do that? And there it was again. The question that had followed her from the first shot on the range from the corridor from Hayes's office. The same 4 words from a new mouth, meaning something deeper each time it was asked. Where did you learn that? My father, sir, Megan said, and this time saying it, something in her own chest eased that had been tight for 7 years. His name was Thomas Walker. He pulled lost people off mountains for 20 years and never took a dime for it. And the thing he understood better than anyone I've ever known, her voice caught just slightly, just once, was that you can't save someone by proving you're stronger than the mountain they're lost on. You save them by figuring out how they got lost and then walking in there after them and showing them the way out. That's all I did today, sir. I just did what my father did. I found a lost man, and I walked in after him. Crane looked at her, this old grieving general, and for the first time in 4 years, the thing behind his eyes was not rage. It was something that might, given time, become peace. Thomas Walker, he said quietly. Is he I'd like to speak to him, a man who could build this in his daughter. I'd like to shake his hand. Megan was quiet for a moment. He passed, sir, she said. 7 years ago, my last year of high school, he never saw me enlist. He never saw any of this. Crane absorbed that. And then this 3-star general in front of 100 officers on a range he had come to win did a thing that no one who was there ever forgot. He straightened and he brought his hand up and he saluted her. Not the way a general acknowledges a corporal, the way one soldier honors another. Then he saw enough, Crane said, when he built you. Dismissed, Corporal Walker. And thank you for finding me. The salute should have been the end of it. In every version of the story that traveled around the base over the next few days, and it traveled fast the way these things do, the salute was the end. The rookie beat the general's trap, told him the truth about his son, and the general saluted her. Clean, finished, a good story with a good shape. But Megan Walker knew it wasn't finished, and she knew it that same afternoon standing in Hayes's office while the colonel poured 2 cups of coffee and tried to find words for what he'd just watched. In 11 years, Hayes said, I have never seen anything like what you did on that range. And I don't mean the shot. He handed her a cup. I've been trying to figure out what to call it, and I keep landing on a word I don't like. Which word, sir? Dangerous. He sat down heavily. Not you. What you did. You stood in front of 100 officers and you took a 3-star general apart in public. You did it gently, you did it kindly, and God knows you did it truthfully, but you did it in front of everyone. And Aldous Crane may have saluted you today, Walker, But he's still a three-star general who was just shown to be grieving and wrong in front of every officer on this mountain. Hayes met her eyes. Men don't always forgive the person who was right about them in public. Sometimes the kindness is the thing they can't forgive. Because now every time he looks at you, he'll remember the one who saw all the way through him. And some men can't live next to that. Megan set her coffee down untouched. You think he'll come back at me? I think grief is a strange animal. And you just poked it, and I don't know what it's going to do. Hayes leaned back. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that man goes home tonight and sleeps for the first time in 4 years. But I've been doing this too long to bet a soldier's career on hope. So I'm telling you to watch your back. Not from Crane the general. From Crane the father who just had a stranger tell him the truth about the worst thing that ever happened to him. He was right to warn her, but he was wrong about the direction. Because the danger when it came, and it came 4 days later at 0900 on a Thursday, did not come from Aldous Crane. It came from a man named Colonel Preston Vance, and it came in the form of a formal inquiry. Megan was called to a conference room she'd never been in, and seated at the head of a long table was an officer she'd never met, a lean, precise man with a folder squared perfectly in front of him, and the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided how a thing would go. Hayes was there standing off to the side, and Hayes's face was carefully blank in a way that told Megan more than any expression could have. Corporal Walker, Vance said. Duh. Sit. She sat. I'll be direct because I respect efficiency. 4 days ago, on an evaluation range in front of assembled officers, you obtained the location of a concealed target by extracting information from your assigned spotter, Corporal Ellis. Vance opened the folder. Is that accurate? And there it was. Megan felt the shape of it immediately, the way she'd felt the shape of the quarter trap, the way she'd felt the shape of Crane's scenario. This was a man who had taken the one part of her victory that could be made to look ugly and was going to build a case out of it. That's not quite accurate, sir, she said. Then correct me. I didn't extract information from Corporal Ellis. He didn't tell me anything. Corporal Ellis stated for the record on the range in front of the general that he never broke the scenario and I never asked him to. It's documented, sir. It is documented. Vance smiled thinly, and Megan understood she was dealing with someone genuinely skilled, someone who had come prepared. And I've read Corporal Ellis's statement. He says you asked him if there was a section of the range he'd been told not to go to. He declined to answer. And you say I'm quoting your own account now that his silence told you where the target was. He folded his hands. So let me ask you plainly, Corporal. Did you locate the target by reading the reaction of a soldier who had been given confidential staging information, yes or no? Megan was quiet for a moment because the honest answer was yes, and Vance knew it was yes, and he had constructed the question so that yes sounded exactly like cheating. Yes, sir, she said. I read his reaction, and I'd do it again. Thank you for your honesty. Vance made a note. Then you understand the problem. Corporal Ellis was staged with information he was ordered to keep confidential. You obtained the benefit of that confidential information by reading his response to a question designed to provoke exactly that response. The fact that he never spoke the information aloud is, I'm afraid, a technicality. You engineered a situation in which his knowledge leaked to you nonverbally. That is not marksmanship, Corporal. In some readings, it is a form of coercion of a subordinate, and it calls the entire result into question. The room was silent. Hayes had gone very still against the wall, and here is where a lesser soldier would have reached, would have gotten angry, would have protested, would have insisted it wasn't fair. And Vance was waiting for exactly that, the way Crane had waited for it, because an angry corporal is a corporal who has lost control of the room. But Megan Walker had spent her whole life learning not to reach. Sir, she said calmly, may I ask you a question before I respond? Vance's eyes narrowed slightly. Go ahead. Who ordered this inquiry? A flicker. Small, but she caught it. That's not relevant to the matter at hand. With respect, sir, I think it might be. Because 4 days ago, I passed an evaluation designed by a 3-star general, and the general in question saluted me on the range in front of 100 witnesses and thanked me personally. He did not question the result. He accepted it. So I'm trying to understand who 4 days later decided that a result the evaluating general himself accepted needed a formal inquiry. She kept her voice even and unhurried, Because in my experience, sir, when the person who ran a test is satisfied with the outcome and someone else opens an investigation into it anyway, the investigation is usually about something other than the test. Vance's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You're a corporal, he said. You don't get to interrogate the origins of a lawful inquiry. No, sir, I don't. I apologize. And she said it in a way that was genuinely respectful and yet somehow made his refusal to answer land in the room like a confession. Hayes against the wall had to work not to let anything show on his face because he had just watched her do it again. She had asked the one question, the loose thread, and Vance's refusal to pull it had told everyone in the room that there was something behind it. Let's return to the matter, Vance said, and his voice had cooled several degrees. Whatever the origin of the inquiry, the substance stands. You obtained an advantage by reading confidential knowledge off a subordinate. I intend to recommend the evaluation result be voided and the fast-track promotion that placed you in this unit be reviewed. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Megan looked at him for a long moment. Yes, sir, she said. I have one thing. May I speak plainly? By all means. You've built a very good case, sir. It's clean and it's careful, and every piece of it is technically true. And I want to acknowledge that because it deserves acknowledging. If I read your case the way you've built it, I'd almost believe it myself. She paused. But you've made one assumption in it that isn't true, and the whole thing rests on that assumption. So I'd like to name it. You've assumed that reading a person is cheating. Reading confidential information off a You've assumed, Megan continued gently but without stopping, that a sniper's job is to shoot and that everything else, reading terrain, reading weather, reading the enemy, reading the fear on a man's face, is somehow outside the job, that it's a trick, a shortcut, something separate from the real skill. Her voice stayed level. But sir, reading people is the job. It's the whole job. A sniper who can only shoot is a rifle. It's the reading that makes them a soldier. On the corridor, I beat a shooter who defeated 11 teams, and I never fired at him until the last second because the whole fight was reading him, reading his patience, his caution, the way he used a deer as a message. Nobody called that cheating. Command wrote it up as the finest field result this unit had produced in years. She let that sit. So I'd ask you, sir, with real respect, what's the difference? Why is reading the enemy on the corridor the highest form of the craft? But reading a nervous spotter on a range is coercion. The skill is identical. The only thing that's different is that on the range I read someone on our side, and I did it without asking him to break a single rule. Vance opened his mouth and closed it. The difference, that he said finally, is that Corporal Ellis is a subordinate, and you have a duty of care toward... I agree completely, sir. She didn't let him build it. I have a duty of care toward Corporal Ellis, and that's exactly why I designed his job the way I did. General Crane handed me a terrified 19-year-old and expected me to either use him up or fail because of him. Those were the only two moves the scenario allowed, and I refused both, sir. I gave that boy the smallest, safest job on the range, and I protected him from a situation designed to hang him. Corporal Ellis walked off that range, having succeeded in front of a 3-star general, because I made sure his one job was something he could not fail at. If you want to talk about my duty of care toward that soldier, sir, I'd welcome it, because I think I discharged it better than the scenario that put him in danger did. She held Vance's eyes. The reason he stood up and defended me to a general he was terrified of is that he knew that I'd looked out for him. That's not coercion, sir. Coercion doesn't make a scared kid brave enough to speak up for you afterward. The room was very quiet now, and Hayes, watching from the wall, understood that the inquiry was already over, even if Vance didn't know it yet, because Megan hadn't argued the technicality. She'd changed what the room was about. Vance had walked in to try a case about cheating, and somehow the case had become about which of them had actually protected the vulnerable soldier in the story, and that was a case Vance could not win because he hadn't been there, and she had. But Vance was not a man who folded easily, and he had one card left, and he played it. This is a compelling speech, Corporal, he said, but it doesn't change the facts, and I've made my determination. I'm going to recommend the result be voided. He began to square his folder. You may be a gifted reader of people. I don't dispute it. But gifts don't override procedure, and my recommendation stands. And then the door opened. Nobody had knocked. The door simply opened and General Aldous Crane walked into the room, and every officer at the table came to their feet, and Colonel Vance came to his feet fastest of all, and something in his face changed the moment he saw who it was. "Sit down," Crane said. "LeVue, not you, Vance. You stand." Vance stood. "I understand," Crane said, and his voice was very quiet, which somehow made it worse, "that there's an inquiry into an evaluation I personally conducted. An evaluation whose result I personally accepted. An evaluation I closed on the range with a salute in front of 100 officers." He walked slowly to the head of the table. "And I understand that this inquiry was opened 4 days later without my knowledge by an officer under my command. Would you like to tell me, Colonel Vance, why you opened an investigation into my evaluation without informing me?" The silence in the room was total. "Sir," Vance said, "I believe there were procedural irregularities that—" "You believed?" Crane's voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. "Colonel, 4 days ago, Corporal Walker did something on that range that I have spent 4 years telling myself was impossible. She got out of a trap that has no way out. And she did it in part by refusing to sacrifice the frightened boy I handed her. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The single thing you're trying to hang her for, reading Corporal Ellis, is inseparable from the single most decent thing anyone did on that range that day. She read him in order to protect him. You can't void one without voiding the other. You can't call it cheating without calling her care cheating too. Sir, with respect, the procedure—" "I know what the procedure is, Vance. I wrote half of it." Crane stopped directly in front of him. "So let me ask you the question. The corporal was too polite to ask twice. Who told you to open this?" And Colonel Preston Vance, who had walked into this room with a folder squared perfectly in front of him and a case built like a watch, said nothing at all. "Nobody told him, sir," Megan said quietly. Every head in the room turned to her. "Explain that, Corporal," Crane said. "Nobody told him." She looked at Vance and there was no triumph in her face. Only that same unbearable seeing kindness she'd turned on the general 4 days before. "He opened it himself, and I don't think it's because he thought I cheated, sir. I think Colonel Vance is a man who has spent his whole career doing everything the right way in the right order, waiting the right amount of time for every promotion, following every procedure to the letter." She said it slowly, watching his face confirm each piece. And 4 days ago, he watched a 25-year-old corporal fast-track past people who'd waited decades beat the hardest evaluation in the Army in 11 minutes. And something in him couldn't let that stand. Not because it was wrong, because it wasn't fair. Because he did everything right for 30 years, and it never once felt like this. And here I came and got it in 11 minutes, and that's, sir, that's not a small thing to feel. "That's a wound. I've seen it before." Vance had gone pale. "You don't know anything about me," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. "No, sir, I don't. And I'm sorry, I really am, if I've read you wrong." She held his eyes. "But I don't think I have. I think you're the man who did it all correctly and never got thanked for it, and watching someone skip the line felt like the world telling you your patience never mattered. And I'd like to say something to that, sir, if you'll let me, because I don't think anyone ever has." She took a breath. "Your patience mattered. Everything you did the slow right way, it mattered. It's the reason this room trusts a case when you build one. It's the reason a general has to stand here and take you seriously instead of dismissing you. The line you waited in built something in you that I don't have and can't fake. I got here fast, sir, but I got here hollow in places. You're solid. That's not nothing. Don't let watching me make you believe your whole road was a waste. It wasn't. It made you." The room did not breathe, and Colonel Preston Vance, career officer, 30 years of doing everything the right way, stood in front of a general and a colonel and a corporal and felt the case in his hands turn to sand. Not because he'd been beaten, but because he'd been seen all the way down to the small, hard resentment he'd carried so long he had mistaken it for principle. He looked down at his perfectly squared folder for a long moment. Then he closed it. "I'm withdrawing the inquiry," he said quietly. "There are no procedural grounds sufficient to void the result. My recommendation is that the evaluation stand." He looked up, and his voice was steadier now, and something in his face had changed the way something in Crane's had changed on the range 4 days ago. "And for the record, sir, and for yours, Corporal, I'd like it noted that the withdrawal is on the merits, not on the general's arrival. I'd reached the conclusion before he walked in. I just hadn't said it yet." It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it was a lie, and it was also the most honest thing a proud man could offer, the small dignity of pretending he'd gotten there himself. Megan gave it to him without a flicker. "Understood, sir," she said. "Thank you." Crane looked between them, and something almost like a smile touched the hard old face. "Dismissed," he said, "all of you." And then as the room began to empty, Corporal Walker, "Stay a moment." The door closed, and it was just the two of them, the general and the corporal, in an empty conference room. Crane sat down heavily at the table, and for a moment he looked less like a three-star general and more like a tired old man who'd driven a long way. "I slept," he said. Megan waited. 4 days ago, that night, after the range, he turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "For the first time since Daniel, I slept the whole night. No dreams about the scenario, no going over it. I just slept." He looked up. "I came back today because I heard about the inquiry and I wanted to stop it. But that's not the only reason I came back. I came back because I've been thinking for 4 days about a thing you said. You said the way to save a lost person isn't to prove you're stronger than the mountain. It's to figure out how they got lost and walk in after them." His voice thickened. "I've been walking into that mountain after Daniel for 4 years, Corporal. But I've been walking in angry, trying to prove something. And you're the first person who ever told me that the way out isn't proving anything. It's just putting it down." "Yes, sir. I don't know how to put it down." And Megan Walker, 25 years old, looked at a grieving general more than twice her age, and she did not offer him a technique or a plan or a piece of advice. She did the thing her father had done at 100 trailheads, the thing that came after you found the lost person and before you brought them home. She told him the truth about her own mountain. "When my father died," she said, "I was 17, and for about a year I did what you did, sir. I looked for someone to blame. It was so sudden. One day he was teaching me the winds, and the next he was just gone, and it didn't make sense, and I needed it to make sense. So I went looking for a reason. A doctor who missed something, a choice he made, a thing I could have done." She turned her own untouched cup, and I couldn't find one. There was no one to blame. It was just a thing that happened, and that was so much worse than having someone to be angry at, because anger at least gives you somewhere to point. The truth just sits there. It just is. Crane was very still. "How did you put it down?" he said. "I didn't at first. I carried it into basic. I carried it through my first year." She looked at him. "And then one day I was on a range, and the wind came up the slope the way it used to come up the mountain when he'd take me out before dawn, and I realized he wasn't gone. Not the way I'd been telling myself. Every single thing I did well, I did because of him. Every wind I read, he taught me to every second I waited, he taught me to wait. He was in my hands, sir. He'd been in my hands the whole time, and I'd been too busy grieving the man to notice he'd never actually left." Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't quite. "That's how I put it down. I stopped looking for him in the empty chair, and I started finding him in the things I could do, because that's where he actually was. That's where he still is." The conference room was silent. "Daniel wasn't a soldier," Crane said quietly after a long time. "Not really. He joined because I wanted him to. He was gentle, Corporal. He was funny. He could sit with a scared kid and make them laugh. He could talk anybody down off anything. He had this way of making people feel like the most important person in the room." The general's voice broke just slightly. The Army had no idea what to do with a boy like that. So it fast-tracked him for his scores and put him in a scenario built to break shooters, and it broke him because it was measuring the one thing he wasn't instead of the 1,000 things he was. And here was the last twist, the deepest one, the thing that had been sitting underneath the whole story from the moment Hayes first said Daniel's name, because Megan Walker understood in that instant what the general had truly lost, and it was not a failed shooter. "Sir," she said gently, "Daniel didn't fail because the system lifted him too fast. And he didn't fail because nobody taught him to get out of the trap. He failed because the Army put a healer in a killer's scenario and then acted surprised when the killing wasn't what he was good at." She leaned forward. "There was nothing wrong with your son, so there was something wrong with the test. It was measuring the wrong thing. It looked at the most gifted person reader you'd ever raised, and it called him a failure because he couldn't shoot the way it wanted." Her voice was very soft. "The tragedy isn't that the system broke a weak soldier. It's that it never once saw how strong he actually was. It had a gift standing right in front of it, and it graded the gift as a failure. Failure because it was pointed the wrong direction. Crane put his face in his hands, and Megan let him. She did not reach across the table. She did not say another word. She sat with him in the empty room the way her father had taught her to sit on a cold mountain before dawn without speaking, without moving, without rushing anything, just being present while another person found their own way through. When Crane finally lifted his head, his eyes were wet, but his face was different. Something that had been clenched for 4 years had come loose. "I'm going to change the test," he said. His voice was rough but certain. "The whole evaluation program. I'm going to build something that measures what a soldier actually is instead of the one narrow thing we have always graded. Something that would have seen Daniel. Something that would have seen what he was good at instead of what he wasn't." He looked at her. "I've spent 4 years using that test to prove the system was cruel. I'm going to spend the next 4 making sure it never does to another kid what it did to my son." "He'd be proud of that, sir," Megan said. "You never met him." "No, sir. But I know what it looks like when a person spends their grief building something instead of breaking something." She stood and she came to attention. "My father spent 20 years walking into mountains after strangers because he lost someone once and decided nobody else should be lost if he could help it. That's the same thing you just decided to do, sir. You just decided it in a conference room instead of on a trailhead." She held his eyes. "Daniel's going to save a lot of soldiers, sir. Every kid your new test catches, every gentle one, everyone who's good at the 1,000 things the old test couldn't see, that's going to be Daniel saving them. You're going to make your son into the reason they don't fall. I can't think of a better thing to build out of losing someone." General Aldous Crane looked at the young corporal standing at attention in front of him, and for a long moment he could not speak at all. Then he stood slowly, and for the second time in 4 days he saluted her. "Where did you learn all this, Corporal?" he said, and his voice was thick. "Not the shooting, this, where a 25-year-old learns to walk into a grieving man's mountain and lead him back out." And Megan Walker held her salute, and she gave him the only answer she had ever had, the answer that was the whole of who she was, the answer that a man in Montana had spent a childhood building into her without ever knowing how far it would one day carry. "Same place I learned everything, sir," she said softly. "My father. He just taught me to find people. He never told me there'd be so many of them lost." The salute in the empty conference room should have closed the story, and for a while it seemed to. The evaluation stood. Vance withdrew his inquiry, and to the surprise of everyone who knew him, requested a transfer into Crane's program to help redesign it. And the two of them, the proud man who'd done everything the slow right way, and the grieving man who'd done everything the angry wrong way, turned out to be exactly what each other needed. Word of what Megan Walker had done spread beyond the base. Command took notice. And 6 weeks after the range, Colonel Hayes called her into his office with a look on his face she'd never seen there before. "They want to promote you," he said. "Fast again." Megan didn't answer right away. Sergeant then strayed into an instructor track. "They want to build a program around what you do. The reading, the way you solve things nobody else can. They want you teaching it inside a year." Hayes leaned back. "It's everything, Walker. It's more than anyone your age has ever been offered in this program. And I'm telling you, as someone who's watched you now for months, you'd be good at it. You'd be extraordinary at it." He waited for her to be pleased. She wasn't. "Can I think about it, sir?" she said. And Hayes, who had learned by now that Megan Walker never said or did the expected things, sat forward slowly. "You're not going to take it." "I don't know yet, sir." "Walker, they are offering you the fast track to the top of this entire program. People wait 20 years for a tenth of what they're putting in front of you." He studied her. "What could you possibly be weighing it against?" And Megan Walker looked at the colonel, who had gone from doubting her to defending her to now plainly not understanding her, and she told him the truth because she'd stopped lying to herself about it somewhere in the last 6 weeks. "Sir, can I ask you something first?" "Go ahead." How many soldiers wash out of this program every year? The gifted ones, the fast-tracked ones, the ones who score perfect and then break in a scenario built to break them. She kept her voice level. "Give me a number." Hayes's face changed. "Too many, he said quietly. "You know that. You met the man who spent 4 years counting them." "How many are there right now, sir, on this base?" This month, kids who are one bad scenario away from becoming another Daniel. How many are out there right now already lost and nobody's walked in after them yet? Hayes was quiet for a long moment. More than I'd like to admit, he said. Then that's what I'm weighing it against, sir. She held his eyes. You're offering me the top of the program, and I'm sitting here thinking about the bottom of it, about all the Daniels who are already in trouble and don't have anyone who knows how to find them. And I'm trying to figure out which one my father would tell me to go do climb to the top of the mountain or walk back down it after the people who are lost. Hayes didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. He'd asked what she was weighing the promotion against, and the answer was other people's children, and there is no argument you can make against that from behind a desk. 3 days later, Megan Walker turned down the fast track. She did not turn down the sergeant's stripes. Hayes made her take those, and she let him, because he had earned the right to make her take something. But she turned down the instructor track at the top of the program, and she asked instead for something no one had ever asked for, something that made command genuinely confused when the request came across their desks. She asked to be assigned to the strugglers, the washouts in waiting, the gifted kids who were failing, the fast-tracked ones who'd stalled and were 3 weeks from being quietly moved out. She asked for the exact soldiers that everyone else in the program had written off, and she asked to work with them not as a star instructor teaching a master class, but as a sergeant assigned to the ones nobody else wanted. Crane, when he heard, drove 3 hours to ask her why in person. You had the top of my program, he said, sitting across from her in the mess hall, an old general and a new sergeant, 2 coffees between them. I offered to build the whole thing around you, and you turned it down to go work with the kids who are failing. Explain that to me, Sergeant, because I've been trying to understand it since I heard and I can't. Sir, do you remember what you told me about Daniel? That the Army had a gift standing right in front of it and graded it as a failure because it was pointed the wrong direction. Crane's face tightened. I remember. There's a kid in my group right now named Torres, 19, scores off the chart fast-tracked, and he's about to wash out because he freezes on every time scenario. Command's already got the paperwork half filled to move him out. She turned her cup. I spent 2 days with him before I figured out why he freezes. It's not fear, sir. It's the opposite. He sees too much. He notices everything, every variable, every possibility, and under a clock, it overwhelms him and he locks up. The exact thing that makes him freeze is the exact thing that would make him the best reader in the program if anybody bothered to teach him to channel it instead of grading him for drowning in it. She looked up. He's a Daniel, sir. He's pointed the wrong direction and the test can't see him. And there are 6 more like him in my group alone. Crane set down his coffee. So that's why Megan said, you offered me the top of the program, but the top is where the soldiers already made it. I don't want the ones who made it, sir. I want the ones who are about to be told they didn't, because those are the ones nobody's walking in after. And I know how to walk in after people. It's the only thing I've ever really known how to do. She held his eyes. You're going to fix the test. That's your gross, and it's a good one, and it'll save people for decades. But the test won't be fixed in time for Torres. He needs someone this month, and I'd rather be the person who gets to the lost ones before they're gone than the person at the top of a program that catches them a little more gently on the way down. For a long moment, General Aldous Crane just looked at her. You know, he said finally, when I came to that range 3 months ago, I came to prove that fast-tracking gifted kids was cruelty, that it lifted them up just to drop them. His voice was rough. And here you are, the most fast-tracked soldier I've ever seen, turning down the top of the ladder to go stand at the bottom and catch the ones who are falling. He shook his head slowly. You didn't just prove me wrong, Sergeant. You went and became the thing that proves I was wrong. Every kid you saved down there is another argument against everything I believed when I walked onto that range. No, sir, Megan said gently. Every kid I saved down there is Daniel. Same as your test. We're doing the same thing, sir. You're building the net. I'm walking the mountain. It takes both. And that was the moment the last hard thing in Aldous Crane finally fully let go, because she had done it again. The thing she always did, taken his grief and shown him. It wasn't a wound to nurse, but a tool to build with. Taken the worst thing that ever happened to him and made it somehow into a thing he shared with her. A thing they were both now spending their lives repairing. The work was not glamorous. There were no impossible shots in it, no ghosts on corridors, no three-star generals to face down in front of assembled officers. There was just Torres freezing on his scenarios and Megan sitting with him for hours teaching him the thing her father had taught her, not how to see less, but how to hold everything he saw without drowning in it. How to let the variables cancel each other the way three winds cancel across a valley. How to wait for the settle. The first time Torres passed a timed scenario, he came off the range shaking and he found Megan and he couldn't get the words out at first. "I didn't freeze," he finally said. "Sergeant, I didn't. I saw all of it. Everything same as always. And I didn't lock up. I waited like you said. I waited for the thing to go quiet and it went quiet and." He stopped and his eyes were wet, this 19-year-old who'd been 3 weeks from being told he wasn't good enough. "They were going to move me out next week. They had the papers." "I know," Megan said. "I saw the papers. That's why I asked for you." "Why?" Torres' voice cracked. "Why me? There's 100 guys in this program who never freeze. Why'd you pick the one who was failing?" And Megan Walker looked at this kid, this gifted, drowning, nearly lost kid, and she gave him the answer that was the whole shape of her life. "Because somebody once looked at me," she said, "when I was young, and everybody had already decided what I was, and instead of grading me on the thing I couldn't do, he taught me the thing I could. He didn't pick me because I was easy Torres. He picked me because I was worth the trouble. And you're worth the trouble. You've been worth it this whole time. The test just couldn't see it." She put a hand on his shoulder. "So now you know what it feels like to have somebody walk in after you when you're lost. Remember it, because someday there's going to be a kid drowning the same way you were, and you're going to be the one who knows how to reach them. That's the whole point. That's the only point. We find the lost ones, and then we teach them to find the next ones." Word got around. It always does. Within a few months, the strugglers Megan Walker had asked for the washouts. The freezers, the fast-tracked kids who'd stalled, were not washing out anymore. Torres passed his evaluations and asked to stay on to help with the next group. Then another one did. Then another. And something began to happen in that program that command could not quite account for on paper. The soldiers everyone had written off were becoming one after another, the ones who came back to save the next round of written-off soldiers. Crane's new test caught them on the way in. Megan Walker's work caught the ones the test still missed. And between the two of them, the net and the mountain, the number of Daniels began for the first time in the history of the program to fall. A year to the day after the shot on Raven Ridge, the impossible shot, the one that had started all of it, the one 8 veterans had called impossible before a quiet 25-year-old stepped forward and read 3 wins nobody else could see. Colonel Hayes stood up in front of the assembled unit to present a commendation. The room was full. Miller was there in the front row, the sergeant who'd called her paper, and now could not say her name without something catching in his throat. Reyes was there. Ellis was there, the terrified boy from the range, not terrified anymore. Vance was there, in from Crane's program. And Crane himself was there, a 3-star general who had driven 3 hours to stand in the back of a room and watch. Hayes read the commendation, and it was full of the language. These things are always full of exceptional service. Distinguished conduct, the words the Army uses when it's trying to hold something that doesn't fit in words. And then he set the paper down and he looked at Megan and he went off the script entirely. "I'm supposed to read you that," he said, "and then hand you this, and we're all supposed to clap, and we will. But I want to say the real thing first because a piece of paper isn't going to hold it." He paused. "A year ago, I read your file and I let 3 of my best men tell me you didn't belong here, and I half believed them. I called you a perfect score and nothing else. I thought the first time the mountain pushed back, you'd fold." His voice thickened. "And then the mountain pushed back, and it pushed back harder than I've ever seen it push on any soldier. An impossible shot. A ghost nobody could catch, a general who came to break you, an inquiry meant to end you, and you didn't fold once. Not once. But that's still not the thing I want to say." He looked out at the room. "The thing I want to say is that you could have taken all of that and climbed straight to the top of this program, and nobody would have blamed you. And instead, you turned it down and went to sit with the kids who were failing because you decided the view from the point wasn't worth as much as the ones you could catch at the bottom. And in 20 years of doing this, Sergeant Walker, that is the finest thing I have ever watched a soldier do." The room was silent. "So this commendation," Hayes said, holding it up, "it's not really for the shot or the corridor or the general. It's for the ones nobody's ever going to write a commendation about. Torres, and the six after him, and the ones they're going to save that we'll never even hear about. That's what this is for. It's for the mountain you decided to keep walking back down over and over after people who were lost. He held it out to her. On behalf of a lot of soldiers who don't even know your name yet, thank you. Megan took the commendation. And she did the thing she always did, the thing that undid people more than any shot she didn't make a speech. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at the room at Miller and Reyes and Ellis and Vance. And in the back, an old general who had come a long way, and she said one thing. My father used to walk into mountains after people he'd never met, she said. Because he lost someone once and decided nobody else should stay lost if he could help it. He never got a commendation for it. He never wanted one. He'd have been embarrassed by all of this. A small, true smile. So I'm going to take this because Colonel Hayes will make me. But it's not mine, it's his. Everything I've done here he built, and he never got to see a single piece of it work. So this is for Thomas Walker, a search and rescue volunteer from a town you've never heard of who taught a little girl to sit still and listen and never once knew how far it would carry. Her voice held steady the way she taught herself, the way he taught her. That's all. Thank you. That winter she went home. She went back to Silver Creek, back to Montana, back to the mountain where a man had once made a 7-year-old sit beside him in the cold before dawn and not speak and not move until she finally learned to hear the 1,000 things the world was always saying. She climbed to the place he used to take her. And she stood there a sergeant now with a commendation in a drawer back at the base, and a general who saluted her and a sergeant who'd called her paper and now couldn't look at her without pride, in a room full of soldiers who had been lost and weren't anymore. And she stood in the exact spot where all of it had started, and she listened to the wind come up the slope the way it always had, the way it had the morning she'd made the impossible shot, the way it would long after she was gone. She didn't cry. She'd taught herself not to, and anyway, it wasn't a grief anymore. You were right, she said out loud to the wind, to the mountain, to a man who couldn't hear her, and somehow had never really left. Skill doesn't belong to one kind of person. It belongs to anyone willing to work for it, and it doesn't disappear because people can't see it. It waits, and it grows. She stood there a long moment. You waited your whole life to be seen for what you were, and you never really were not the way you deserved. But I see it now, Dad. Every single day, in every kid I pull off a mountain, I see exactly what you were. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure they see it too. The wind came up the slope and moved through the trees, 3 bands of it, top and bottom. And the small quiet one in the middle that mattered most, and for one breath everything went still, the way it always did right before the shot, the way it always would. And in that stillness, Megan Walker understood the thing that had been waiting for her at the top of the mountain all along. Her father had never taught her to shoot. He had taught her to find the lost, to walk in after them, to wait for the settle, and lead them home, and the rifle had only ever been the smallest part of it, the tool, the excuse, the thing that got her into the rooms where the real work was. The shot on Raven Ridge had never been the point. The point was the boy who didn't freeze anymore, and the general who finally slept, and the proud man who put down his resentment, and the 6 after Torres, and the 6 after them, a line of saved soldiers stretching out past where she could see each one taught to walk in after the next. That was the legacy, not the impossible shot. The impossible number of people one patient man on a mountain could save decades after he was gone through the daughter he taught to listen. She turned and started down the slope, back toward the work, back toward the ones who were still lost and waiting to be found. Because in the end, one shot was never really about hitting a target. One shot fired clean on a freezing morning by a woman everyone had underestimated was about proving that the quietest person in the room is often the one who sees the most, and that real skill, the kind that's grown slow and passed down careful and paid forward without asking for anything back, does not vanish when the world fails to notice it. It waits. It grows. And when the right moment finally comes, it doesn't just speak for itself. It teaches everyone else to speak too.